Welcome to Conversations with the Pastor, the hippest show in the Pacific Northwest, where we talk about current events and things that matter to you. We're here every Wednesday at 6 p.m. Now listen, this is an interactive conversation. That means we need you to ask questions via Facebook or Pastor Conversations at the NBCF.org. Don't miss out. Now let's start the conversation. Pastor?
Good evening and welcome to another edition of Conversations with the Pastor. And yes, it is that, a conversation. And what makes it a conversation is that we go back and forth. This is not to be confused with a monologue. This is the dialogue. So as we used to say back in the days when we had phone books, white and yellow pages, let your fingers do the walking across those keys on your keyboard and send in your questions that are triggered by the conversation that unfolds. Today, we are privileged to have a very special guest, and that is none other than U.S. Congresswoman Marilyn Strickland, who is in our nation's capital as we speak, enjoying the unusually bitter cold of the Northeast or the East Coast at this time of year. So I want to welcome her to Conversations with the Pastor. Welcome, Congresswoman Strickland.
Great. Well, it's great to be here, Pastor Braxton, with you and your audience. It is 24 degrees right now, and by the time we end this conversation, it will be 23 degrees. So yes, it is clear and cold in the nation's capital.
I am amused at this outfit that you're wearing. It's like a black version of Little Red Riding Hood's cloak, but I'm glad that you are warm.
Thank you.
I am so privileged and grateful for your time, as I know these are busy times in our nation's capital as we're getting ready to go through a transition from one administration to another, and there's lots of global and international news going on. And so as a U.S. Congressperson, I know this is a very busy time for you. Let me ask you in general, you were in Washington the last time Trump was president of these United States. What are your expectations going into his second ascension to the office of the presidency versus the first? Do you expect it to be more of what it was a few years ago, or do you expect it to be different this time?
So thank you for that question, but one slight correction. When Donald Trump was elected president, I was mayor of Tacoma at the time.
That is correct.
And I remember being in Washington, D.C. for the annual U.S. Conference of Mayors meeting. Mm-hmm. And the last time I was in Washington, D.C. until I became a member of Congress. So I got elected in 2020. I got sworn in on January 3rd, 2021. And you all remember what happened on January 6th, 2021.
Yes.
There was a failed attempt to basically overturn a legitimate election. Yes. So as I think about the second term of Donald Trump, understanding that, we had 4 years with Joe Biden and Kamala Harris in what was a very remarkable time in the presidency, because he came in during the pandemic. Mm-hmm. He got us vaccinated. We sent lots of money to states and local government and to individual families through the child income tax credit, through unemployment checks, all those things. And so now we're coming out of that 4 years later. And I will tell you honestly, it is baffling still when you think about the policy victories and how successful Biden and Harris were, and the fact that the majority of people, Pastor, and I'm going to say this, who turned out to vote chose Donald Trump. And so, there's still a very strong record for Biden and Harris to be proud of, investing in infrastructure. That money will continue to come to the states over the next few years. And we want to make sure that we know that it was Nancy Pelosi as Speaker of the House and Joe Biden and Kamala Harris in the White House that helped us do these amazing things that the American people are going to benefit from in the next few years, for sure.
Well, we know that history is a story of the fact that oftentimes people are viewed more favorably in the long lens of history than they are at the time, if they in fact are persons who they and their impacts are ahead of their time. We just seen that with Jimmy Carter, who did not get a second term, but in fact his impacts and policy have been long enduring. So that leads me to this question. What sense does yourself and Democratic leaders make of the loss of the 2024 presidential election? Was it just a matter of clumsy messaging? Was it a matter of Biden choosing too late to get out of the race? What sense of it? I don't need to prejudice the question more than that. What's in the postpartum assessment? What kinds of sense are Democratic leaders making over why, given the strong policy achievements of the Biden administration, that it didn't carry over to his lieutenant, his vice president, in terms of giving another term to that agenda?
So I would say a few things, and I'm speaking for myself as a member of the Democratic Party, not anyone else who is part of the party. So I would say a few things. I think one of the things that we learned is that, the whole idea of running a presidential campaign or the brand of a party, the messaging doesn't just start when it's time to win an election. The messaging happens the day after the last election. Mm-hmm. And if you look at where people consume information and where they get it these days, it's not just the way it was when we came up, right, Leslie? Yeah. It wasn't just TV, radio, and print, right? There's social media. There are all these podcasts. There are all these specific channels that target specific people. And as you know, sadly, there's just a lot of lies and misinformation being peddled out there. And so I think one of the things that we've learned as Democrats is that we have to compete on the same field and make sure that our messaging is get out. The other thing I think that's interesting, too, when we talk about what happened to Democrats, I often hear President-elect Trump say that it was a mandate. It was not a mandate. No. He got one of the lowest vote totals in the history of the United States for a presidential election. Mm-hmm. And even, Congress, we actually picked up a few seats as Democrats. We're still in the minority, but that margin is so thin for the Republican majority. And in many cases, it's going to be hard for them to pass anything without some Democratic votes, because as a party in Congress, they are completely dysfunctional and have so much infighting. We still lost, make no mistake. But I think as I look back on what we can do better next time, it's understanding that the election for 2026 and 2028 started on November 6, 2023, and we need to think of it that way. And we have to think about how people are getting their information and pursuing those channels. I mean, I even say to folks sometimes, we know that Fox News does what it's going to do and spew lies, but we as Democrats cannot be afraid to go on those shows and challenge some of these things, because we have to fight back and we have to push back.
Former MSNBC hardball host Chris Matthews used to say that the difference between the Republicans and the Democrats was that the Republicans will fumble the ball, but they'll raise their hands and scream touchdown. And they'll keep on screaming it until people start to believe them. And next thing you know, they got the wave going on in the stadium, when in fact they fumbled the ball. But the Democrats will actually score a touchdown, but don't know how to do an end zone dance. So is it and
not tell people that they scored and not keep repeating that they scored?
Yes. And so, if Trump had had the numbers that Biden had in terms of jobs, that infrastructure bill, the CHIPS Act, and on and on and on, he would have blown that trumpet all day long. But when the Democrats had these achievements, whenever Biden or any of his acolytes began to speak them, folks said, you're going to sound tone deaf. And so it seems that Democrats are shamed out of claiming their victories, whereas Trump shoves his losses down your face, down your throat, as if they're victories. Are we not, is there something here to us learn about the boldness of taking credit for actual gains?
Well, I mean, I would say that, we have to learn how to fight. And we have to learn how to fight to win. And I'm not saying that any elections or any candidates have not done that, but I want to give you a really specific example. Okay. So if you look at the congressional races, we actually picked up seats. So members of Congress who are Democrats actually outperform the presidential ticket, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there's a reason for that. We have to run for Congress every 2 years. So we are constantly in community. We are constantly sending out information about here's how we can help you. Here's what we're doing. You know, we were showing up in places, whether it's like the smallest gathering or the largest gathering, but we are consistently showing up and doing the work. So in many ways, when we run for reelection, we're running under, yes, as a Democrat, but it's the brand of Marilyn Strickland. It's the brand of Hakeem Jeffries. It's the brand of Maxine Waters. And so different people are running under their own brand as Democrats because we're constantly in community. Now think about a presidential election, right? We have a nominating convention, we pick someone, we have these big events, we have people knocking on doors, but they are not in community the same way that we are.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lesson to be learned about, you know, a presidential candidate cannot be present that often because they're not running as often. But how do we replicate the presence of a Democrat who could be at the top of the ticket so that when someone says, I'm going to choose a presidential candidate, the Democratic brand is so strong, that's their preference?
Well, there's an old saying that says that a lie circles the world 7 times before the truth gets out of bed. And you mentioned that the Republican brand, Trump, they lie. They make no concern for telling the truth. Do Democrats need to get better at lying, or is there a way we can make the truth as provocative and as inviting as mistruths, misinformation, and disinformation?
I would say 2 things. When we hear a lie and misinformation, we need to call it out. And look at the words that you just used. You didn't say misinformation. You said these are lies. We have to be very explicit about that.
Yes.
The other thing we have to do too is, you know, my background is in marketing and communication. And so I am very aware of the power of repetition. You have to say something so often that people are tired of it, that you get tired of saying it. And that's when it finally starts to sink in. So again, we have to understand that the next election starts the day after the one that just happened. And that is how we are more strategic. We have to go to channels and places where people are getting their information. And, you know, one of the things that I really noticed about this particular election is somehow the Democratic Party brand is not as appealing to men. Now, demographically, African Americans still showed up for the Harris-Walz ticket. But if you look at the other demographics, the men clearly did not. And so what is happening in this country with politics or even messaging about the Democratic brand or just messaging in general that has nothing to do with politics, that has an effect on how people view the Democrats?
You just stuck your foot in something. And is it that the Democratic messaging is not as appealing to men versus the agenda of the Democrats? Because I think the agenda of the Democrats is far more empowering for men than the Republican, because they actually have no agenda. Their agenda is stoking resentment toward women. And so is it a question of how do we get men in this country, many of whom are undereducated in terms of acquiring the skills to give them the type of economic footprint in the modern economy? Mm-hmm. And so how do Democrats get them to understand how the Democratic agenda actually will empower them in their lives for the things that they want? Because the only thing that Republicans have done is make men believe that the rise of women is coming at their expense.
Well, think about this for a second. That's a really good point you make. It's almost as though the rise of anyone who doesn't fit my demographic profile is somehow compromising me. And just pick a group.
Yes.
Right? Mm-hmm. And then think about, again, the whole conversation about economic security, because that's really how a lot of men define themselves, right? People mm-hmm. think of men as what? As providers, mm-hmm. as breadwinners. And when that opportunity doesn't exist, or in some cases, when people feel as though they are being surpassed, even if they're doing well for themselves, that can foment some resentment. Yes. Think about this. If we look at gun violence and the mass shootings that take place in the United States, or just gun violence in general, it is mostly committed by men.
Yes.
if we look at the despair that is happening in countries, in this country, around some of the communities where manufacturing got hollowed out or people can't provide, again, men are affected by this disproportionately. But here's what's interesting. When we talk about economic challenges, no one is affected by that more than Black folks. Yet we still show up for Democrats, because I think for us, yes, the economic issues are important, but we also know that there are other issues that come along with that that will affect our livelihoods, right? Voting rights, criminal justice reform, whether or not we're able to build wealth, to buy a home. And so I think that as African Americans, we tend to look at the entire picture, and we think about what our ancestors had to go through just to be treated as equals in this country, whether it's housing, voting rights, all the things that we fought for. So in some cases, we're not going to disrespect our ancestors. We have been taught not to do that because we know the sacrifices that people that we are still around and with made for us to be here today. But it's a really interesting dynamic if you break it down by gender, by race and ethnicity, by education level, by income. It's a very interesting study. And then I ask myself sometimes too, seriously, was this election even about issues? I don't have the answer to that, because I think about all the things we talked about. The best president for unions, created more jobs than any other president, all these things that talk about economic security, yet somehow the majority of men in this country did not choose Harris.
Well, I point out to some folks that Trump has run for president 3 times. The one time he lost, he lost to a manifestly diminished white man. The 2 times he won against 2 of the most qualified people to ever run for the White House. And one, Hillary Clinton, was arguably the most qualified, and Kamala close to that, and he being the one of the most incompetent, unqualified, ill-suited, and ill-tempered. But it seems that after Barack Obama won twice, that being a woman is a bigger handicap than even being Black. And so I think misogyny had a whole lot to do with it. And I think the fingerprints of white evangelical religion and pulpits and churches are all over the outcomes of this election.
It's an interesting thing you talk about when you bring up the election of President Barack Obama. And, and we all know this, it was historic.
Yes.
He had a message of hope. And here's the deal, voters like change. And he was talking about change. And then remember, when he was running for his second term, unemployment was very high at the time. I think it was like 8%. Over 7%.
It was down from 10 to 8. Exactly.
And I remember the pundits were saying, no president has ever been reelected when unemployment has been above 7.5%, which is what it was. And he still got reelected. And so to your point, perhaps there is a strain of misogyny that exists within the electorate. I was looking at the images from Jimmy Carter's funeral, and you saw the president and ex-president sitting in 2 rows. And as I looked at those images, the only thing that stood out to me was that Donald Trump beat 2 of the most qualified candidates in the history of America, Hillary Clinton and Kamala. I mean, that is exactly what I thought when I saw that image. But, I think for me, it's like, okay, so we will do many autopsies about what happened in 2023, but it is 2024, and we have a House to retake to get Hakeem Jeffries the gavel, and we have to win back the White House in 2028. But the immediate assignment in front of us right now is taking back the House majority, because in many ways, we will be the backstop against bad things that could happen.
So that segues into my next question, and that is, how will you and the other members of this current Congress and Senate, how will you protect the gains and pursue a progressive agenda during this second Trump presidency, where there is a Project 2025 out there that people in his circle help craft, and they've already started implementing some of the things on that. And that is, it is an agenda to take us back to a former time in America, and to kick the legs out of the rise of minorities and women. It's to change the landscape of American society. So what are we going to do? What do you even need from us as local people to at least limit the amount of decline, the amount of backstepping that we do over these next 4 years?
So I would say this, Donald Trump is going to be in the White House soon.
Mm-hmm.
The Democrats are in the minority in both the House and the Senate.
Mm-hmm.
That does not mean that we just sit on our hands for 4 years, because we still have work to do. So as I mentioned earlier, what we can do is do our best to keep bad things from happening. I would say the first thing, as I talked about earlier, we have to communicate what this means to the American people. So come March, we're going to be facing another government shutdown. And when I say government shutdown, most people don't even know what that means. But it's important to describe exactly what that's going to mean. It's going to mean that your Social Security checks are going to get delayed. It's going to mean that people who work at TSA at the airports are not going to get paid. It's going to mean an economy that is destabilized. And so when I think about describing what could happen, we have to be very stark and very clear about what's going to happen. I often feel like we have been fighting since 2016. And with every election cycle, we ask everyone, okay, you guys, gear up, do what we got to do. It is a fact that Black people are the base of the Democratic Party.
Absolutely.
Our voting demonstrate that. So there is no question. When I hear people say the base of the party, I am always very clear. Black people are the base of the Democratic Party. Those are just facts. That's how we vote. And what I want to try to tell anyone who's watching or listening is that we know that this is a marathon. We know that the hill gets steep. We know that we have to keep fighting. And I know that sometimes you feel like, why do I keep fighting when everyone else keeps letting us down? And here we are with Trump in the White House again, and we lost a majority because we don't have the luxury of stopping. So catch your breath, engage in self-care, love on your family, take care of your health, but understand we got to go to battle again as soon as we can. And I would say the first order of business is taking back the House of Representatives and getting Hakeem Jeffries the gavel. And by the way, I want to talk a bit about the Congressional Black Caucus. We are now 62 members strong, the largest affinity caucus in the U.S. House of Representatives, all-time high. We started with, I think, 13 members back in the day. And what I remind folks of, there is leverage in those numbers. There was a time when if you belonged to the Congressional Black Caucus, you came from very specific geographic areas with minority Black districts. We now represent the entire spectrum across the entire country. We have African-American, Janelle Bynum of Oregon. She flipped the seat from red to blue in Oregon State. That would have been unheard of even 10 years ago. So my punchline here is there are Black folks in every corner of the country who belong to the Congressional Black Caucus, the CBC, and we're leading the way to fight back against Project 2025, whether that is fighting to make sure that we're saving Social Security, Medicare, the Department of Education, letting people get overtime, a whole host of things. And the fight that they are going to wage against DEI because they act like diversity, equity, and inclusion takes something away from people when we know that DEI is actually good for business, it's good for decision making, and it's basically good for the entire country when we lift everyone up.
So what would you do if Donald Trump said he wanted to meet with the Congressional Black Caucus and, maybe he wants a photo op out of it, try to make himself more appealing, raise his numbers among African Americans, so some cynical objective behind it? Would you all meet with him? If you did, what demands would you put before him? How would you handle that? Because he's such a manipulator of media. I could anticipate him sending that overture there, but not for any good reason.
So, one of the things that we do know is absolutely true is that the House Republicans take their marching orders from Donald Trump. Mm-hmm. And as I mentioned earlier, what we can't do is just sit here for 4 years and do nothing. The needs of our community do not disappear because Donald Trump is in the White House and the Republicans have the majority in the House and Senate. And so if we were to have a meeting with President Trump, the leadership of the Congressional Black Caucus should take that meeting. Mm-hmm. And we should say, you made the claim during the campaign that you were good for the African American community. You said that you are the best president for the African American community. So put your money where your mouth is. We have to be very intentional about how we do that. And we have to say, okay, here are the things that we want from a policy perspective. Tell the House to deliver it for us. And we go on record with it. And when we say that here's what we want, what we need, what you promised in the campaign, and he doesn't deliver, well, then he's showing us again who he is.
What do you anticipate in terms of major opportunities or challenges going into this new administration, this new Congress? There's downsides, there's always upsides. Are there any opportunities for us that are that maybe we're overlooking?
I would say that in any situation, you always have to look for the upside, right? And, I sit on two committees, House Armed Services and Transportation and Infrastructure. And we had our organizing meetings for both committees today. And the chair and ranking members of these committees, a Republican and a Democrat, they both said, we work in a bipartisan manner. So I'm like, okay, you said it out loud. You said it on the record. Let's talk about what bipartisanship should look like. Let's talk about policies that we can put out together. What Hakeem Jeffries often says, and a lot of leaders who are part of the Democratic Party is like, we will work in a bipartisan manner when it makes sense. We will not compromise our values, but when it makes sense and there's an opportunity, we will do that. If Republicans want to work with Democrats and say, we want to provide more funding to historically Black colleges and universities, we're for that. If they say that we want to help you increase home ownership with the African American community and improve access to capital, yes, we're for that. If they say that we want to do what we can to bolster Black-owned businesses because we believe that everyone has a chance at the American dream, we're for that.
Absolutely.
So there are things that we want to do. And the Congressional Black Caucus, our agenda is very straightforward. We want to help build wealth for our people and our families. And we want to focus on housing, jobs, and justice. And those three buckets will encompass every policy that is important to us, from voting rights to criminal justice reform, to making sure that people have good jobs, good health care, good education. All those things are interrelated. So if there are Republicans in the House who are saying, yeah, we want to work with you on those things, we would be irresponsible to not do what we need to do to help our people. So that's, I think most people who are watching this would agree. Now, we're not fans of Donald Trump, and we're not fans of some of the Republicans who are MAGA extremists. But at the same time, we have to keep fighting for our people, regardless of who's in the White House and regardless of whether we're in the majority. But make no mistake, our plan is to take the House back in 2026 and make Hakeem Jeffries our speaker.
Well, that's the fourth time you've mentioned that, so that's the big takeaway. The number one goal, take back the House in 2026.
Yes.
Do you anticipate that there might be an opportunity next couple of years to get a new Voting Rights Act?
It's really interesting because, I got to Congress in 2021, Pastor, and renewing the Voting Rights Act has always been like pretty ministerial. Okay, here it comes again, let's renew it. But then you saw Republicans start to say, wait a minute, if we're renewing the Voting Rights Act, then we can't engage in voter suppression. That's been part of their long-term strategy across the country, kicking people off of voting rolls, making it hard to vote, not allowing vote by mail, right? All these things, closing precincts in predominantly Black neighborhoods, all these things. And so we have to continue to fight for the Voting Rights Act. And here's what I say to folks. If you talk about mail-in voting, that benefits everybody in every party. Absolutely. Because a lot of people who are elders, it's hard for them to physically get out and vote. Or if you work a shift and you can't get out to the, to the precinct, to the ballot. And so I just think that sometimes when we think about these certain things, voting rights do not necessarily favor one party or the other. But when you engage in voter suppression, you are definitely trying to hurt Democrats and people of color.
Absolutely. Michelle Obama announced that she's not going to be at the inauguration. Will you and the other members of the Black Congressional Caucus be there?
So, it's an interesting conversation that's come up. So I think that everyone, not just in the Congressional Black Caucus, but across the entire Democratic caucus, people are going to make decisions about how they want to spend that day. Because as you know, that's the day we celebrate the birth of Martin Luther King Jr. Yes. And so some people will be at home in community. Some folks will be in Washington, D.C. at the inauguration. But I remind folks of two things. Number one, Donald Trump did not go to Joe Biden's inauguration.
No, he didn't.
And it's not unusual for people who, of the opposing party, of whoever is in office, to decide to skip it. I plan to go. Other members of the CBC plan to go. And some members of the CBC plan to be at home in community. And so I think that just depending on what you think is best for you and what you need is what people are going to choose to do. But here's what we're not going to do. We're not going to criticize or demonize people for whatever choice they make. And so if people decide they want to be there, that's their decision. If they decide they want to be home in community, that's their decision too. But I also tell folks that, this is across the entire caucus, not just the CBC, the Hispanic caucus, the Equality Caucus, the Asia Pacific American Caucus, and just the Democrats overall. I know that Democratic leadership plans to be at the inauguration, but again, I'm not going to judge anybody on any decision they make. They're going to do what they think is in the best interest of their district and the people they represent.
Well, I want to thank you for logging on and being with us here all the way in our nation's capital and taking some time out from that cold weather in D.C. to extend your warmth to people back here at home. Blessings for you there. We're going to be praying for you as you guys swim those trepidatious waters, and just continue to tell us what you need the troops back home to do, because we're all fighting the same fight of lunging toward that more perfect union. We believe it. We believe
Thank you. And again, as I said earlier, just self-care, take care of your loved ones, take care of your mind and body and spirit, and just understand that, this is a marathon, not a sprint, and we got work to do to take back the house.
Thank you. God bless you. We'll see
Thank you, Pastor. Nice to see you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
All right, you have heard from U.S. Congresswoman Marilyn Strickland as she has talked about the road ahead and some of her thoughts about it. Now we have some questions coming in. So for the balance of our time tonight, let your fingers fly across those keys, and as best we can, let's give vent to some of those questions, concerns that you have, and see what we come up with. Kevin, what you got?
Yeah, I have a doozy for you. Is there more risk in opposing Trump now that he has complete control of the country versus attempting to find some areas of common ground and giving him some easy bipartisan wins to build goodwill?
There's so many layers to that onion to peel. I would say in general, I don't think there's no building goodwill with Trump. I don't think Trump is a man of goodwill. I think he's a man of self-interest. Different people have learned how to handle him, how to play him. Some people know that if you flatter him. Some folks know if you're the last person in the room with him. And so I think Congresswoman Strickland said it was very clearly that the needs of the black community go on. So they can't sit out 4 years and allow our needs to be unaddressed. And so out of sheer pragmatism, they're going to try to find ways to eke out some gains for their constituents under the Donald Trump presidency. What they're not going to do is just boycott them to the point where they don't do their job in representing their people, which means passing legislation that will have positive and meaningful impacts to their folks back home and bringing resources back to their constituents back home. Now, everything's based on mutuality and reciprocity. When bills are passed, usually nobody gets exactly what they want. So one of the realities of politics, it ain't for the faint of heart. Sometimes you got to plug your nose and vote for something over here so that you get what you want over there. So there's horse trading. That's going to go on. That's par for the course. But as far as coddling goodwill, I think Donald Trump is a racist to the bone. That does not mean on a given issue, he may not deem it in his interest to support something that may be of positive benefit to us because he gets something over here. As the Bible says, he means it for evil, but God means it for good. And so I think in the pragmatics of it, they will individually and collectively as a black caucus make those kind of decisions.
Amen. Will we get campaign reform now? Why aren't independents running for president? Why do we only have two parties being seen as our choice? to choose a candidate other than Dem GOP is a wasted vote. They are seen as only spoilers. What can be done to fight misinformation now that social media platforms are going to allow people to lie? A couple of questions there.
I was getting ready to say that's a lot of questions. Let me peel it apart. One thing about campaign reform, I think people need to remember back in Citizens United. Citizens United was the formal response, the Supreme Court response to the election of Barack Obama. And if you recall, Obama rejected federal financing for his campaign because he would have some limits. He mastered raising money online. The black guy outraised the deep-pocketed, historically moneyed interests in the Republican Party. And they trying to figure, he was in the White House, so they figured out how the heck did he do it. And he did it by rejecting federal financing and doing it on his own through the internet. And it was the first billion-dollar campaign. So then they responded with Citizens United, in which they said money was speech. And in terms of free speech, that now all this dark money could enter into politics and you didn't have to know where it was from. Those of us who are a little bit older may remember when when Hillary was running, and they wanted to know who was giving money to the Clinton Foundation, which wasn't even directly her, but they needed to make sure as a national security issue, they wanted to make sure that Clinton wouldn't be leveraged. You haven't heard anybody talking about who's leveraging Trump in terms of the money he got from the oligarchs when he went over to Russia to borrow money because he couldn't get any more money from American banks. And so when a Democrat was running, they wanted to make sure they knew who every dime was coming from. But then when the black guy won, see, folks are always moving the goalposts when we win. Now all of a sudden, they made it legal for dark money to enter because they had to make sure they could win the money game in a time when campaigns are more expensive than ever before. Multi-billion-dollar campaigns now run on TV and all this strategic ads and all of that. So they changed the rules. And now we don't know who's giving in what amounts. And I think until you get that kind of money out of politics, it literally trivializes the contributions that people like me and you make, because then the candidates are catering to the far deeper pockets who can give in chunks what tens of thousands of us can't give in little donations. And that leverages their sense of to whom they are beholding. So yeah, I think that law has to change. That corrupts our politics. Second question, I think someone there they asked was about the two-party system.
Yeah. Why do we only have two parties being seen as our choice, and why aren't independents running for president?
Well, George Washington cautioned against parties at all because he said, because then we'll become sectarian, and sectarian is when you're loyal to the part but not the whole. That's what you see in places like Iraq and Iran with the Sunnis and the Shias, or places of Africa where they're committed to the tribe and not the nation state. And it's hard to have stability and unity as a nation when people don't derive their identity from the nation, or they're loyal to the nation, but they're loyal to their part. People in the Republican Party are not even loyal to the Republican Party. They're loyal to conservatives or loyal to MAGA. And it makes things very unstable. So we have a two-party system, and if one of those parties goes off the rails, which the Republican Party has since the time of Nixon, it decided to be the party of white grievance, then in a two-party system, when one goes off the rail, our whole political system does not have its checks and balances. When you have a party, the Republican Party under Nixon said, it was his members that walked over to him and said, "Doc, it's done," once they heard the White House tapes. His people held him accountable because even though they were loyal to their party, they had certain red lines. those kinds of moderates are no longer in the Republican Party, which has been taken over by extremists. And now you have a Republican Party who can hear the same tape as you and I, and can hear Donald Trump in his own words trying to bribe Zelensky, the new president of Ukraine, who ran on an anti-corruption campaign, a platform. And then for him, Trump, to hold over his head the foreign aid that's already been passed and say, you're not going to get it unless you announce a fake investigation of Hunter Biden so I can use it against Joe Biden in my campaign. So as a quid pro quo, I'm asking you to engage in an act of corruption for me if you want this foreign aid money. An impeachable offense. But then the Republican Party simply says, we are not going to hold you accountable. The House can impeach him, which means to bring charges, but in a Senate trial, we are not going to convict him. So we're not going to hold him accountable at the law. Your system breaks down then. And so our system's not working because one of our two political parties has been taken over against extremists who says there's one set of rules for you, one set of rules for us. Character matters if it's a Democrat. So it matters for Clinton. For a Republican, for Pete Hegseth, it doesn't matter. For Trump, it doesn't matter. Their crap literally doesn't stink. And so it is the corruption, the depravity, the lack of moral temerity within the Republican Party, who only defines a lawful outcome of an election as in terms of if they win. Because of that party under siege, our political system is warped because we only have two parties. If we were like England, where they have a multiplicity of parties and one goes off the rail, the impacts are quite minimal because there's several other parties. Unfortunately, there have been no parties besides the Democrats and the GOP that have been able to gain enough popularity to where they could be a legitimate threat to win an election, so they are reduced to a spoiler at this point. Perhaps someday another party will rise up to gain enough public support to where there are 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 parties that legitimately can win an election. And at that point, it'll be a greater accountability for any party because they won't have such a big share of the overall electorate.
I'm going to go just to another something real quick. What do you think the world's going to be like with Trump's war on DEI at this moment? What changes do you think are going to occur in our society coming up?
We knew this fight was coming. We thought it was going to happen around 2035. I'm a sociologist by training, my undergraduate studies and others, and history is a story of the fact that when privileged groups, the predominant groups that have been in privilege and power, when there's large-scale demographic shifts and people feel threatened, their privilege feels threatened. As Reinhold Niebuhr says, privileged groups never voluntarily give up their privileges. They must be demanded by the oppressed. And then Frederick Douglass says, power concedes nothing without a demand. People are not concerned about right. People are only concerned about right if right helps them win. People are concerned about winning. They don't do the right thing. They do the thing that's right for them. And so when the Voting Rights Act was passed initially, white Americans were 77% of the U.S. population. Today they're 55% and falling, and every 4 years we have a presidential election, they're 2% less of the overall share of the population. And they've always perceived their numerical dominance as critical to their maintaining their political and their social dominance. That's the panic that's underneath all our issues, from immigration to criminal justice to partisan redistricting, trying to put in place the legal and the political framework for minority rule when they're no longer the majority. That's what's going on. That's the song sheet that they're singing from. Project 2025 is an attempt to socially engineer, take us back to 1955 America. And so I think under Trump, with the attack on DEI is to reverse the impacts of being intentional about embracing the diversity of this country since the U.S. Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1972, which accelerated the demographical change. and being equity, because in the past we've got 3 centuries, 4 centuries of legal de facto and de jure inequity. And we didn't have inclusion, we had rejection. So because of that, that has changed the position in the minds of a lot of white Americans that their privileged place is now being threatened. And so they want back the America where, when you look at Congress, it doesn't have as much color as it does today. You saw Congressman Strickland talking about 62 members of Congress. There wasn't 62 black members of Congress. There wasn't 62 black members of Congress when the Voting Rights Act was passed. 1965, there wasn't. And the demographics don't support that. So Zuckerberg is down at Mar-a-Lago, kind of coddle favor with Trump. And one of the things that Trump has required, get rid of your DEI. All corporations now. That's a bad word, like quotas back in the 80s. Get rid of quotas. And we're going to take away all those special visas that allow the engineers to come in from other countries because they're coming in black and brown. So what we're really putting in place is the policy and the legal framework, from the immigration and the visas to the DEI, the exclusion of the DEI platforms and so forth, to Supreme Court rulings, so that what you're really going to have over the next 10, 20 years is you're literally going to have a racial transformation of who's running the tech industries and all of the other industries. So this is, by policy, public policy, you are going to shift back. And so that privilege, white privilege, is going to be advanced, promoted by the policy shifts that have predictable outcomes to their advantage. That's the game plan. Now, the question is, how do we mitigate that? How do we blunt that? How do we stop that so that all of us can participate in the horn of plenty, or as it says in the preamble to the Constitution, to secure the blessings of liberty. That's what it says. We, the people of the United States of America, in order to secure a more perfect union, establish justice, to secure domestic tranquility, to provide for a common defense, to promote the public well-being, and to secure the blessings of liberty for ourselves and our posterity. Establish justice, secure the blessings of liberty for all of us. For all of us. So what do we have to do from a policy standpoint, legislative standpoint, to defeat a conservative Supreme Court, a House of Representatives, and a Senate in which the party of grievance is in control, and a president in the White House who's racist to the core? How do we do that? It's going to take some good politicking. And as Congresswoman Strickland said, we got to make sure we take back the House in 2 years and begin the process of getting back on our feet and having the power that we need to exercise it judiciously on behalf of justice.
Cool, cool. Some of us know the positive things that Democrats have done for our country. How come Democrats have a hard time talking about it, telling us what they're actually doing?
Well, as part of what I said to Congresswoman Strickland is I think Chris Matthews hit it on his head when he says Republicans fumble the ball and they put their hands up and they say touchdown. And this goes back to the George Bush era, where Karl Rove, he was the political genius behind the Bush White House, W. Bush. People talk about Cheney and Condoleezza, but Colin Powell and all the likes. But really, the genius was Karl Rove. And Karl Rove said people remember the last thing they heard before they went to bed. And he was the first one to say, just lie. Tell them what you want them to believe, and just keep saying it over and over and over and over again and over again, and they'll begin to believe it. And so as a result of that, that's the political norm nowadays. And so one of the things Republicans do, even when they fumble the ball, they tell you it was a success. They say they had a mandate, even though it was one of the lowest voter turnouts in terms of winning. It was the thinnest margin that we've had in about 5 or 6 presidential voting cycles, even though it came down to a couple of 100,000 votes in 4 or 5 critical states, swing states, and so there was no mandate. You're talking about a 51-49. It was no mandate. And against a candidate who had 6 weeks to get ready. So you had no mandate. You had a demoralized Democratic base because the students were upset over the war in Gaza. And I said in the spring of last year, if they don't pull the students back in, if they don't take a bold stand against Netanyahu, they're going to lose the election because without the students, Democrats cannot win. Did I not say that over and over again? I'm not a genius. I understand our constituents. It's math. And without blacks voting in zealous numbers, without young people and voting in significant numbers, and without Hispanics voting, women and men in numbers, we can't win. You split that coalition or demoralize any aspect of it, Republicans will win despite the fact that they're a shrinking share of the American public because all their folks are going to turn out, and if a significant number of our folks don't turn out because they got a chip on their shoulder, something stuck in their craw, we're going to lose because we just didn't show up. That's what happened. And so I think going forward, Democrats have to learn from Trump. We ought to at least be as bold in talking about our successes as he presents his lies. Biden couldn't talk. I mean, he stutters to begin with, and then his speech was getting slurred just as a process of age and how it came on him. But he should have had a team of people out there every day talking about the fact that we're the only Western industrial country that didn't fall into recession as a result of the pandemic. And while inflation went up, we chose a hike in inflation versus recession because do you want to pay higher prices out of a paycheck, or do you want to pay higher prices without a paycheck? It's that simple. When I say it like that, you get it. But he couldn't say it that succinct, that clear. And Democrats have to get better at messaging, but the first thing they have to do is stop telling people you're tone deaf because you tell the truth. If I come home and say, baby, I brought my check home and, you know, all the bills are paid, she said, you supposed to do that. That's not going to stop me from saying, yeah, I'm supposed to, but there's a lot of dudes who didn't. I brought my check home. It's in the account, and I didn't spend it at the bar on the way home. Now, I could, so somebody ought to say thank you. That's just me. But you not go, if I score a touchdown, I'm going to dance. You can throw a flag for delay a game. But if I score a touchdown, I'm going to dance.
You got me laughing. That was a good one. You've definitely touched on this, and I don't know if you want to add anything more when someone asked about the misinformation now that is going on social media platforms that allow people to lie. Is there any way we can combat it? And I think you were saying basically we just need to tell our story over and over and over again. Is there anything else you want to add?
I would say this as maybe a final comment. A lady asked Benjamin Franklin in 1785 when they were in the midst of the constitutional conventions. And she said to him, Dr. Franklin, what kind of government have you made? Is it a monarchy or a republic? And Benjamin Franklin, 81 years old at the time, he said, it's a republic if we can keep it. And there's a series of questions I would ask about that. And one of them is, since a democracy requires a free press that will give fact-based, honest, unbiased reporting that parses the issues of our day and holds accountable the other three branches of government to be the default fourth branch of government, can we keep our republic if, in fact, our media is no longer going to be committed to fact-checking? If, in fact, you can, without restraint and without consequence, deliberately misinform the public to manipulate them, when journalism is replaced wholesale by propaganda, and you have a confused public who is either discouraged from participation or participating based upon false information, can you keep your republic? History will answer that question, but there is a reason why. Every dictator and despot, including Hitler and now Trump, one of their objectives to gaining and keeping power has been to degrade the press and the public's trust of the press, so that when they hold him accountable for the deeds done and explain to the public the impacts of it, they simply won't believe it. Power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. And history is the story of that. Empires do not fall because of foreign tanks that overrun their battles. They fall from within because they became corrupted to the core.
Amen. Amen.
Thank you for tuning in today. We had a conversation with Congresswoman Marilyn Strickland, who went to school with Edison Elementary School and Gray Junior High School and Mount Tahoma High School with my wife, Sheila, who sent her regards before we got down here. And she made a point of saying, Leslie, Sheila looks exactly the same. She's never changed over all these years. Good black just don't crack. So Sheila, I want you to know, Congresswoman Strickland says you look the same as you did in high school in Mount Tahoma, where you were the student body president. Ain't I lucky? But thank you for all tuning in this week in this edition of Conversations with the Pastor. Join us here next week at 6 o'clock, same bat time, same bat channel, where my guest is going to be the iconic Northwest African-American journalist Charlie James, talking about his storied career as an African-American journalist in the Pacific Northwest, trying to keep it real and keep things pushing. So take care of your health, take care of your wealth. We have a series of King Day programs next week. On Monday, we'll be down in Lacey at New Hope Baptist Church for their citywide King Day program. I'll be keynoting there. Next Monday, I'll be right here at New Beginnings at 7 p.m. for the Evergreen Association of Baptist Churches annual King Day program. And I will be keynoting there. And then next Thursday, we'll be on the campus of the University of Puget Sound for their combined MLK program and annual spring SWOPE lecture. You have to go to the University of Puget Sound website and get a ticket. They're free, but you do have to get a ticket. They have, as of today, moved it from the Kilworth Chapel to the Performance Hall, which has more seating and better sound and lighting and all of that. So we'll see you next week. We'll see you on Sunday morning, where Dana McClendon will be our guest preacher on King Weekend Sunday. God bless you. God keep you.
Thank you for joining another episode of Conversations with the Pastor here every Wednesday at 6 p.m. And like the pastor said, you can join us for worship service on Sunday at 9:30 a.m. We'll see you then.